Hi, everyone. This video is to give a outline of our processes for using Language Line. Language Line is a resource that Durham's Partnership for Children provides to you, and it allows you to connect with a live interpreter in order to have conversations with families who do not speak English. So we will go over the process here of how you can access Language Line. And then next, after this video, we'll cut to a training on how to actually make that phone call. So first things first, we at the partnership just need to make sure that we have records of who uses Language Line, when you use it, in order to ensure that one, we have adequate amounts of funds available to use our interpretation services, and that we are able to show record that certain phone calls were made and why they were made. So in order to do that, we have two forms that we need you to fill out. The first form, which is the Language Line Access form, must be completed prior to your conversation. We ask that you try to fill it out 24 to 48 hours before a conversation. However, we understand that emergencies happen. So we will go over to look at that form together. So this is the first form that you will use, the Language Line Access request. And so again, we understand that emergencies do happen without prior knowledge of a conversation. So we would just ask that at the bottom you indicate that it's an emergency. So when you need to access Language Line, you'll complete this form with your name, email, the name of your site, what date you need Language Line, what language you're requesting, and then a brief description of the conversation. And again, asking if it was an emergency. Once you complete this form, you will receive confirmation via email from either Jamaica or Maryland. So they will send you an email letting you know that you are approved to access Language Line. And then in their email, they will also include the link to the second form that we need from you. So we do ask that you make the phone call as close as possible to the time that you requested, but we understand that things happen. So our second form is where we're going to ask for confirmation that you did use Language Line. So again, once you receive that email, you are good to make your phone call. After the phone call has ended, you will fill out this form, which is our confirmation of Language Line use. So this is just in order for our staff at the partnership to cross-reference our invoice and know what date and time you made the phone call so that we can ensure that we are invoiced correctly. So again, we'll ask for your name, the name of your site, the date you made the phone call, and the time that you made the phone call. The time of the phone call can be approximate. However, we do know that all of us have the ability to check what time we made a phone call. So you can pull your phone records and look at that. But if it does need to be approximate, that will be completely fine. So those are the two forms that we need from you at the partnership. And now I'm going to turn it over to Christian, who is going to give us a training on how to actually place that phone call. So again, just to reiterate, your process will be to complete the Language Line Access form, receive email confirmation, then you will place your phone call, and then you will fill out the confirmation of Language Line use. So I'm going to turn it over to Christian to give us the training on how to make those phone calls.
Hello, this is Christian Womack with Language Line to give a brief training overview about how to use Language Line services.
Thanks so much. So good to be with you folks. We're so glad we can support the great work you're doing in the community. My job as your account executive is to make sure you have everything you need in terms of interpretation services on a day-to-day basis. So what we're going to do right now is go through a couple slides that just show a couple different elements. We'll talk about the nuts and bolts. How do we actually connect to an interpreter over the phone? Then we'll talk about some best practices. We find by leveraging these practices, it's going to help with the overall experience for the families you're working with, but it's also going to help you use your time more efficiently. You have a lot to do during your day, so we want to make sure you're able to move between appointments more efficiently. So I'm going to go ahead and go off camera here. There we go. We can just focus on the slides as they stand. So let's imagine we're ready to interact with a family and we've realized there's a need for interpretation. So how are we going to connect to an interpreter? Perhaps this family is called in over the phone and we're ready to bring an interpreter onto the line, and here's the process we'll go through. Usually at this point, I remind folks that typically we're working with a limited English proficient, meaning this person who's called in is used to navigating language barriers, they're used to being placed on hold, they're used to waiting for an interpreter. So typically a please hold or just a moment will suffice, no matter what language is spoken, typically. So at this point, the family's called in on line 1, you've recognized that need for interpretation, and you've gracefully placed them on hold as best you could. So now you're going to jump over to line 2. And you'll dial out the number you see on the screen there, the 1866 number. In just a few seconds, our IVR system will come on. The first prompt will indicate you should dial your client ID. That's where you'll enter 684473. This is the 6-digit client ID specifically for Durham's Partnership for Children. This acts as your password to get services. This ties back to all invoicing and reporting, so it is essential that this is entered in correctly. So we want to make sure that you have that noted down and you're comfortable doing that. The next prompt will be the language menu. It's going to indicate you should dial 1 for Spanish or 2 for all other languages. Now, Spanish represents more than 80% of the calls that we handle every year. And for instance, this year we're on track to handle about 70 million calls. So we have a pretty good sample size there. But if you needed a language other than Spanish, you'd press 2 and then just clearly state the name of the language. So perhaps you need Arabic or Cantonese or Mandarin or Tagalog or any number of other growing languages in the US. And so in that case, you would just say Tagalog, and then within a few seconds, you'd be connected to an interpreter. Once the interpreter comes on the line, they're going to introduce themselves, and that's where you'll want to go ahead and create that conference call. So now you have the family that was on line 1, the interpreter that was on line 2, you've bridged those all together, and then the conversation can just simply proceed from there. Let's look at some of those best practices when working with an interpreter. So when the interpreter comes on the line, as I mentioned, they'll always go through their same scripted introduction. They'll say, "Good morning, my name is Christian. I'll be your Spanish interpreter today. Interpreter ID 123456. This call may be live monitored for quality assurance purposes. I'm ready to introduce myself." Once you've heard that intro, that's of course your opportunity to be polite, smile, and introduce yourself to the interpreter. And we always say it's important to take 5 or 10 seconds and just give the interpreter as much context as you have for that call. Of course, in some situations, somebody will be calling out of the blue and you'll have no idea what they need, but don't worry, you are working with a professional, full-time, well-trained quality interpreter. They're used to putting on a different hat with every single phone call. They're gonna be ready for anything you throw at them. I think most importantly, we just remember that the interpreter is just an extension of your own voice. So once you've created that conference call and you're ready to interact with the family member, you can simply say, "Good morning, this is Christian. How can I be helpful?" Allow a moment for the interpreter to offer their rendition, and then begin to gather information back from the family member to figure out why they've called and what exactly is needed on that call. So like I said, these are professional, trained interpreters. They are ready for anything that you're going to throw at them. Now, once you've started that conversation, you've gotten through the introduction, you're ready to proceed. Some folks will fall into a really bad habit if they're new to working with interpreters. They might start saying, "Interpreter, please ask Mrs. Jones why she's called in today," or "Interpreter, please ask Mrs. Jones how I can help." Well, we want to remember that, language line, we talk about operating from that place of respect. We want to maintain that direct interaction with this family member. We want to maintain a respectful relationship. You're the expert here. You have the relationship, so we want to make sure that we're able to just support that. The interpreter, as I said, is only an extension of your own voice. So very important to always still interact directly with the client, speak directly to them, just allow a lot of white space in the conversation, a lot of room where the interpreter can deliver their rendition and gather information back from that client and of course provide it for you. Now, to help the process along, remember the goal here is mutual understanding. We want to make sure that we're speaking in short bursts of conversations. Don't get caught monologuing like I am today. Instead, 3, 4, 5 sentence segments at a time. This allows enough room in the conversation, just as we mentioned earlier. This allows plenty of space for the interpreter to go through that rigorous process of taking everything you're saying and making it culturally relevant for the person with whom you're working. We want to remember that there's so many different factors that impact communication, the culture, background, roles in family, roles in society, these different cultures that we interact with just have different criteria sometimes. And so it's the interpreter's job to take all those criteria, roll it all into one, and again, make everything culturally relevant. That's knowledge work and that's difficult work. So we just want to make sure we allow enough space in the conversation for that to happen. Now, I'm based here in California, and we have kind of this stereotype around our surfer culture. I don't know if it's totally true or not, but we have one of those stereotypes where in California we say dude all the time. I don't think it's particularly true, but it serves as a really great example of this next point. It's an incredibly silly example, but I think it's going to help it stick that way. Of course, we want to avoid jargon and slang. These are professional environments, sometimes difficult conversations. So I know you all are going to do that in a professional environment, but this just really helps to underline the idea that we want to really choose our words carefully. Imagine if I was working with an Arabic interpreter and I was throwing the word dude around in the conversation constantly. How unfair is it to ask an Arabic interpreter to come up with a cultural equivalent for dude? So I'm not going to do that, and I know you won't either. Again, it's a silly example, I know, but the silliness helps it stick. Just make sure we're choosing our words carefully. We don't want to make it any harder on the interpreter than it needs to be. And of course, as you start to wrap up these conversations, if you're sensing that your client is not understanding, we always recommend trying a new tact, a different word choice perhaps. But one of the ways to really help uncover some of those gaps is by asking some more open-ended questions as you wrap up the training. Wrap up those calls. It's so frustrating for everybody involved if you release the interpreter and start at the end of the call and then realize that there was one more question or there is some confusion. So we always recommend doing what we call a teach back method. So before closing a conversation, before releasing the interpreter, you might ask something along the lines of, what do you understand about our next steps? Or what do you understand about our call today? Something that's going to really get that client speaking. You're going to hear their train of thought, and then you'll really know for sure there's no more questions. They understood everything that was shared on that call, and you feel comfortable releasing the interpreter and ending that call, knowing that everything was clearly stated, mutual understanding was achieved, which is always going to be our goal. Now, the next couple slides just go through that process again of how do we connect to an interpreter? How do we bridge those lines together? I know everybody's working in different contexts these days. So for those who are working on more of a standard office multi-line phone, just as we talked about earlier, if you receive that call from a family member on line 1, you connect to an interpreter on line 2, and then conference those calls together. Now, if we're placing an outbound call, perhaps we need to follow up with a client, we have a date we need to discuss or something else we need to go over. In that case, we want to make sure we have the interpreter on the phone first. So in this case, on line 1, I would dial into language line, connect to the interpreter, just like we talked about earlier. It just takes a few seconds once you get comfortable with that process. The interpreter will come on the line, they'll go through their introduction, and then you'll explain to the interpreter, we need to call out to Mrs. Jones to discuss A, B, and C. And once you've done that, you'll place the interpreter on hold on line 1, and then on line 2, you'll jump over, dial out to the client, and as soon as they pick up, that's where you want to hit connect or bridge or whatever your button is to create the conference call on your office phone or on that landline. We find that by having the interpreter on the line ready to go before the client is picked up, it just helps to reduce hangups. Sometimes that language barrier can be so great that if you're not recognized as a friend or family member immediately, you're just going to get hung up on. So we want to make sure we have the interpreter primed, ready to go so they can begin immediately speaking, and the call can be handled in language from start to stop. It's just going to be the best experience for everybody. Now, some folks might be working on their smartphones, and it's a little different process, and everybody has different smartphones, so I'm not going to try and cover them all, but just know that it's a very similar process. You'll essentially dial the interpreter, and then you'll always have that join call option where you can add somebody, and you can see that right on your screen. I'll let you Google for your iPhone or for your Android device or whatever device you might be using exactly how to do that. but usually the button is join call or add a caller, depending on the platform you're using. I would recommend practicing that a couple times before you go live with a client. I know on my own personal device, I've tried to get multiple family members on a call and I end up hanging up on somebody. So again, maybe with your team there, you can just call each other on your cell phones and practice a little bit. You're looking for that join call or add caller button, depending on your platform. And once you do it a couple times, the muscle memory will kind of kick in and you'll get more comfortable with that. And I would say the same for our call flow that's up on the screen that we talked about earlier. It's once you go through it a couple times, the muscle memory kicks in, you'll get really comfortable with it. Going through these 3 steps is going to take you just a few seconds after you've done it once. Connecting to our interpreters takes a few seconds. So for example, if you're reaching a Spanish interpreter, we're going to connect in about 10 seconds. Most other languages, it's somewhere in the area of 30 seconds. So for the vast majority of languages that we support, you don't need to plan ahead. You don't need to make an appointment. We should be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week when you need us. So I know this is a ton of information, but just in summary, we've looked at the call flow that's up on the screen. We talked about some of those best practices when working with an interpreter, and you're going to have this slide deck for your review, so feel free to go back over it whenever you need. And then we talked a little bit about those different situations and how we'd create that conference call on a landline or on our cell phone, depending on the context within we are working. If I can offer any more assistance, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm happy to help in any way I can. But these are the basics of how to connect to an interpreter, and we're really excited again that we get to support those families and the great work that you're doing. So thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.